Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to this very exciting class. I'm really excited to be able to welcome you all to the Complete Beginner's Guide to Gemara. I know many of you have been waiting for this for a long time, and we're very excited that Hadron has been able to pull this together. And thank you to Rabbanit Leah Sarna, who is going to join us and be teaching us tonight. She's the Associate Director of Education and the Director of High School Programs at Drisha. My daughter was honored to have her as a teacher at Drisha Summer Program. She's a fabulous teacher, very excited about learning, teaching, and specifically about Gemara. Today's shiur is going to be sponsored by Alana Storch in honor of the entire Hadron team and your continual dedication in creating an enhanced and meaningful Talmud experience for us all. Thank you, Alana. And before I start, I just want to talk a little bit about what this course is all about and why we are now entering into the Complete Beginner's Guide for Gemara. So I want to first introduce all of you to the course. I want to talk about who this course is meant for. If you've never, ever learned Gemara before, never picked up a daf of Gemara, never had a course in Gemara, so this class is for you. If you've learned Gemara in the past in school or post-school or some sort of environment, but feel like you never actually got all the basics down pat. If you've been learning Gemara since the beginning of this new Daf Yomi cycle, or maybe since the beginning of the last Daf Yomi cycle, or you picked it up somewhere in the middle, and you've been learning every day, and you've been hearing these sounds and hearing all sorts of things, but you feel like you're missing some of the background and the perspective and where everything fits in, which I know we get to here and there, and I drop little things, but the idea here is for this course is really meant for a wide range of different people, and I'm sure that some of you will gain certain things, other people will gain other things. And what this really is supposed to be is a springboard to more learning. It's really a beginning, okay, both a beginner's course and really a beginning to get you. The goal of this class is so that you feel at the end that you have the confidence of the basic building blocks that are necessary to get started on a journey of Gemara, or like I said, sometimes kind of to pick up in the middle. So I invite you all to the course. And with that, I'm going to introduce Rabbanit Leah Sarna.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Rabbanit Michelle, for this amazing opportunity to teach some of these ideas that are just so essential for a Gemara study. And even if you've opened up a Gemara, you've listened to a podcast, you've been doing it for a while, and you really feel like you've absorbed so much Gemara content, going back to those basics and those beginnings can sometimes add a whole new level to your learning, because now you'll open up today's daf and you'll be like, oh, I understand what's happening here. And it'll add a whole nother layer to what's going on. And that's something that I'm so excited to be reviewing with people and learning together. Just got a request to move my mic closer, so glad to do that. Let me know if it's okay on the chat. Let me know. Very excited to dive into that today. Some of you have mentioned, oh, I didn't get a source sheet for today's class. We will be looking at a few little sources together, and they'll be on a slideshow that I'm going to start in a moment. So you don't need to have anything prepared. You don't have to have anything next to you or printed out. So don't worry about it. You can just sit back and relax. We're going to leave the chat open, but I won't be watching it while I'm teaching. So just by way of housekeeping, if you have a question that you think, oh, someone else maybe got it, then you're welcome to use the chat for that purpose. But I would definitely say if you're hoping to use the chat to ask me a question, so save it until the end and we'll have some time for a question and answer then. And that question and answer will actually be in the chat. So if you have a question, save it until the end and then put it in the chat at the right time. And that's when I'll be looking at the chat at that time, but I'm not gonna scroll up the whole chat from the whole session. And this is the first of 3. So today what we'll be doing, you might say, oh my gosh, I came for a beginner's class in Talmud, and we're only getting to the Talmud at the end of today. So don't worry. First of all, this is the first session of 3. But second of all, in a moment, I'll share with you why I think it's important to actually start with a little bit of kind of Jewish library history from before the Talmud was even a twinkle in anybody's eye. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to begin our slideshow. All right, so this is the Complete Beginner's Guide to the Gemara, part 1. So as I mentioned, today is going to be an abbreviated history of the oral Torah. And the reason for that, and here's a little bit of a timeline, we'll refer back to this timeline as we go. The reason for that is that the Talmud is a document that is aware of its historical space, and that within the Talmud, when it quotes different things, which it's doing all of the time, right? The Talmud is always quoting a verse here, quoting a statement from here, quoting a teaching from here. The Talmud expects that you understand where those different statements are coming from, and the provenance of each statement gives it a different kind of weight and a different kind of importance. So we have to understand a little bit about where all the materials that the Talmud emerged from, the history that the Talmud emerged from, where all that comes from, because it's actually important when you open up a Talmud, the Talmud expects you to know something about that. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. Next time, we're going to be opening up the Talmud itself and saying, look at all the different layers going on here. Here's how you identify the different layers. Here's how the Talmud sees the weight given to each different type of layer. That'll be the next session of this class. So the Gemara begins with a bit of, not the Gemara doesn't, sorry, the Mishnah contains within it an autobiography of the oral Torah. So anyone who has opened up the Mishnah of Pirkei Avot might recognize this story. The story is Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai. Moses received the Torah at Sinai. And what the Mishnah is trying to tell you is that Moses received both the written Torah and the oral Torah at Sinai. And what did Moses do with it? Moses transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. So let's begin here, because this is the story of when Tanakh, when our written Torah kind of concludes. The men of the great assembly often refers to, or at least was created by Ezra HaSofer, Ezra the scribe, who is one of the last books and lives at the time, the last books in Tanakh, and he lives at the time of the beginning of the Second Temple period. And the men of the Great Assembly, according at least to the Mishnah and Pirkei Avot, were kind of the guardians and the teachers of the oral law in the time of that early Second Temple period. Then the Mishnah goes on to say, Shimon HaTzadik was one of the last men of the Great Assembly. He was Hayam Mishayarei Knesset Havdalah, and then he passed it on to a man named Antigonus from a place called Socho, and then he passed it on to two people, Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan. And this is the beginning of a period called the Zugot. So the Zugot are pairs of scholars. They were co-leaders of the Sanhedrin. And here's when they were approximately. I'll say more about them in a moment, but they're in this approximately 200-year period, and it's a very tumultuous period, which you might know from the Hanukkah story. So it's about this time of the Maccabean revolt, Hasmonean rule over the land of Israel. That's in 160 before the Common Era, and it lasts until the last of the Zugot are Hillel and Shammai. They pass away right before the temple is destroyed. So that really lasts until just into the Common Era. Maybe we would say about year 20-ish of the Common Era. That's the time of the Zugot. So here's just the list of them as we get from the beginning of Pirkei Avot. You'll notice that we started with almost the complete first Mishnah of Pirkei Avot. And so what I did here is, what the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot does is it actually gives you a teaching from each of these generations. I cut out all of those teachings, all of that fruit that you love about Pirkei Avot. Oh, they gave this pearl of wisdom. I cut out all the pearls of wisdom because I'm just interested in kind of the genealogy of the oral Torah. So we have our first Zug, our first pair, Yossi ben Yoezer ish Tzreda, Yossi ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim, and the Zugot are co-leaders of the Sanhedrin at the time, and they create this institution of the Nasi, the patriarch, which continues to, even after the time of the Zugot, the position of the patriarch, particularly after the fall of the temple, is a very, very important position. That's one of the Zugot is the Nasi, is the patriarch, and the second one is the Av Beit Din. He's the head of the Beit Din. So we have this series of of pairs. So Yossi ben Yoezer of Tzreda, Yossi ben Yochanan of Yerushalayim, and they live approximately when the Maccabees are. So that puts it into kind of historical context for you. And then you have Yoshua ben Prachia, Nitai Ha'arbeli. They inherit the positions from them. Yoshua ben Tavai, Shimon ben Shetach. And there's lots of stories from the times of Shimon ben Shetach in particular, who he had relationships to the Hasmonean kings at the time, family relationships, and still it was a time of great oppression towards rabbis, and he really had to fight to maintain the oral law in his time. The Talmud is full of stories about Shimon ben Shetach in particular. Shmaya and Avtalion were the teachers of Hillel and Shammai. And Shmaya and Avtalion, that famous story of Hillel who couldn't afford to get into the Beit Midrash, and he's hanging in the snow. So that's the Beit Midrash that Hillel wanted entrance to, is the Beit Midrash of Shmaya and Avtalion. And then after that, that's the end of the Zugot, and Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who famously fled right before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. He learned Torah from Hillel and Shammai. He had 5 students, and that's the end of the time of the Zugot and the beginning of the time of the Tanaim. So other things that are happening during the time of the Zugot before we move on to our next subject is just that it's a time of this like incredibly difficult diversity within the Jewish people. So for those of you who go to the Israel Museum, there's tons and tons about this time period to learn, but these are the times of the sect of the Dead Sea who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sometimes people call them the Essenes. You also have Sadducees at this time, and the Sadducees they don't believe in the oral law. There may be the like early kind of proto-Karaites maybe, but the Sadducees make lots of appearances in the Mishnah, and the rabbis of the Mishnah are always arguing against the Sadducees. But the Sadducees, their real time was now during the time of the Zugot, while the temple still stood, and they are the ones who are really arguing always against these rabbis who are maybe known as the Pharisees, the Prushim. That's them. And the other thing that's going on here right around right after this time, but really the beginning of the Tannaitic period and throughout it, is also early Christianity, who is also coexisting in this very diverse kind of Jewish milieu. Okay, that's about all we're going to say about the Zugot, and now we're going to move on to the Tanaim. And the first thing I want to tell you about Tannaitic literature, the first genre I want to go into of Tannaitic literature is Midrash Halacha. So we're in the times of the Tanaim. That starts right before the Romans captured Jerusalem and goes until the Mishnah is compiled in the year 200. And we're going to talk about what we mean when we say the Mishnah was compiled. And in the middle of that time, we have the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And that's this huge moment for many of our favorite Tanaim. I gave you kind of a list of rabbis who lived right around the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Rabbi Akiva was quite involved in the Bar Kokhba rebellion, Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Eliezer. One of the big kind of actions that the Tanaim were taking was, as I mentioned, it was a time of great diversity amongst the Jewish people, and the Tanaim didn't love that diversity, particularly Rabban Gamliel was very interested in sort of unifying practice of the Jewish people, particularly once the temple was destroyed. The sense was, how are the Jewish people going to survive in these times? We're going to have one type of practice for everybody, and that's really a lot of the activities of the Tanaim, but not that they were against diversity totally, but they did really want to kind of unify practice. Okay, so what is Midrash Halacha? So Midrash Halacha is a genre of text that bridges the gap between the written and oral law. So it bridges the gap between the written and oral law. It does this by using specific types of literary and logical tools. And there's lots of disagreement about which ones are the correct, call them like hermeneutic tools. Who's allowed to use which ones? Are they only allowed to be inherited, or are you allowed to be creative with it? All sorts of different debates about how Midrash Halacha is allowed to be used. But they use all sorts of these different hermeneutic tools on Torah texts to show how they align with the oral law. And collections of Midrash Halacha are actually mostly compiled after the Mishnah, but the content of the oral law preceded the Mishnah, preceded the compiling of the Mishnah. And when we have these compilations of Midrash Halacha, so you can see here on the right side of the screen, we have on Shmot, we have the Mechilta Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai, often known as the Mechilta. See an example from there in a moment. We have the Sifra, the Sifrei Bamidbar, Sifrei Devarim. These are just like some of the bigger collections. We have actually a lot of fragmentary pieces from many other Midrashei Halacha, but they weren't, these compilations weren't stored carefully and weren't kind of copied as carefully. And you'll see, we'll talk about this more as we go, but that plays a really big role in kind of how the Jewish library worked. But they're organized according to verses in the Torah. So if you want to know, how does, we're going to look at some psukim from Parshat Mishpatim later on. So you want to know sort of like, wow, how does this verse get interpreted into halacha? A great way to look at that, a great way to find it would be in the Midrashei Halacha, because you can just look up in, let's say, the Mechilta, the verse itself. I know I'm interested in Exodus 21, verse 19, let's say, that's where we're going soon. You can open up the Mechilta and to Exodus 21, verse 19, as opposed to if you were looking at a different type of Jewish legal text, where you'd really have to figure out, okay, like, what's the topic? How does that? And you'd have to really do some digging to find the right place, because those are organized more topically, and these are organized according to the chapter and verse in the Torah. Two schools of Midrash Halacha. So there's the school of Rabbi Akiva and the school of Rabbi Yishmael. The differences between those two schools, the development of each of those two schools, that's like for the advanced version of this course. There's lots and lots of scholarly writing about those two subjects. But suffice to say, different methodologies, different rabbis, but traditions from both schools make their way into the Talmud. So it's not that, the school of Rabbi Akiva 100% one. No, today we're going to see an example where something from the school of, where something from, let's say, the school of Rabbi Yishmael actually makes it in, things like that. Okay. There's, as I mentioned this before, so lots of manuscripts of Midrash Halacha have been lost, or we only have fragments. And we're still kind of finding more and more of this stuff all the time. And as scholars find new ways of discovering old manuscripts and new places where old manuscripts are kept. So our collection of Midrashei Halacha is actually growing these days. And the list that I have here is just from Sefaria, but it's representative of some of the more complete collections that we have. And the Midrashei Halacha in these collections are taught by the same rabbis as those that appear in the Mishnah. So these are Tanaim. But it's important to mention that this practice of Midrash Halacha, so if the practice of Midrash Halacha is bridging the gap between written and oral law, that practice of Midrash Halacha is continued by Amoraim, who use often the same tools of Midrash Halacha, but typically in more limited ways. Since this is with Hadran, and Hadran is all about Daf Yomi, or is in large part about Daf Yomi, it was exciting to note that Midrash Halacha, collections of Midrash Halacha appear on today's Daf. So we have a story in today's Daf, Ahuda Vatani Hilchata, Sifra, V'Sifrei, V'Tusafta. There's a certain man who used to study Halacha, the Sifra and the Sifrei. Those are two collections of Midrashei Halacha that were on the previous slide. He also used to study Tosefta, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. V'shachiv, and he passed away. Nachman lispide mar. They said to Rav Nachman, let the master eulogize him, eulogize the person who passed away. Amar hichi nispide. He said to them, how can I eulogize him? Hi, Tina Damale Sifrei de Chaser. Should I say, alas, a basket filled with books is lost. And Rashi comes in here to explain that although this is a person who had studied these books a lot and studied these words a lot, he didn't really understand them correctly, and he didn't study them correctly with a scholar, and therefore Rav Nachman was sort of critical of his learning nevertheless. But anyways, mostly I'm not going to really go into this story. I'm sure Rabbanit Michelle discusses it on today's podcast, but definitely just fun to note that these collections of Midrashei Halacha appear in today's daf. Okay, so here's just an example of Midrash Halacha. So what do we mean when we say that we're bridging the gap between the written Torah and the oral Torah? So as I mentioned before, we're going to look at Exodus 21, 18 through 19, and here are the verses. When people are fighting, and one strikes the other be'even, over a grove, with a stone or with a fist, v'lo yamut, and the person doesn't die, which would put it into a whole other, now that would be talking about murder. Here we're not talking about murder, we're talking about injury, we're talking about damages, but he doesn't die, but instead, v'nafal mishkav, but instead he has to take to his bed. Im yakum v'hitalich b'chutz al mishanto. So if he then gets up and walks outdoors on his staff, meaning he has some kind of recovery, then nikah hamakeh, and the nikah hamakeh rak shivto yited v'rav ho'yarav. So the assailant goes unpunished. The assailant is kind of cleared of maybe like criminal charges, but he does have to pay for shevet. He has to pay for the injured party's inability to work. And he must pay for his cure. He must pay for his healing, maybe. So the Midrash Halacha is very interested in what Verav Hoyarapeh means, and it gives a bunch of different understandings of it. But one is Bahakatuv. This is from the Mechilta, by the way. Bahakatuv l'lamdich derech eretz. The Torah comes to teach us proper deportment. Rak shift hoyitain v'rav hoyarapeh. The verse says, except that he must pay for his idleness and his cure. The Midrash Halacha here comes to say, what does this verse come to teach us? Shenitan reshut lerofe lerafut, that permission is given to doctors to practice medicine. Now, there's a whole like history of science and medicine behind this today. You would be like, what do you mean? Of course, doctors can practice medicine. Why do I even need the Torah to tell me that? But actually, when we learn more about the history of the way doctors were maybe viewed in the past, and even within the Mishnah, it's actually a quite interesting subject, the way doctors are viewed even internally in Jewish texts. Not as obvious. It's not as obvious to them as it is to us. And I think maybe the view into it is if you've ever kind of heard of Christian Science or had any interactions with that world where they really believe like, no, like God heals and humans don't heal. That's really the perspective there. That here the Midrash is coming to say, no, humans are allowed to heal. God gave permission for humans to heal. So we're gonna come back. We're gonna revisit this Midrash Halacha later. But for now, it's just all I want to point out is that we have psukim and then a teaching that's derived from those psukim that's not in any way kind of the obvious thing that verse is talking about. Like if I showed you this verse and I said, is it talking about permission to doctors? And you would say, no, it's about damages, it's about injuries, it's about, do we try someone in criminal court or not? It's about all sorts of things, about people fighting, but I'm not sure you would directly say, oh yes, it's about giving permission to doctors to heal. And that's really this like hermeneutic that has been practiced onto this verse to learn something out of it that maybe wasn't obvious from the verse itself. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the other genre of Tannaitic literature, which is straightforward legal teachings. We're going to talk about the Mishnah. So this is on the right here, you have a beautiful edition of the Mishnah from the Kaufman manuscript. It's probably our most complete or our best existent manuscript of the Mishnah. It was scribed in the 10th and 11th century. And if you ever are reading the Mishnah and you see that there's maybe more than one potential version of the Mishnah, one of the best places to go is actually the whole Kaufman manuscript. It's available online because we live in amazing, miraculous times. And actually the Kaufman manuscript is a great place to look if you want a really authoritative version of the Mishnah's words. And it's so beautiful, and anyone who can read Hebrew can read this Hebrew, which is not always the case with manuscripts. So that's another really fun thing about the Kaufman manuscript. All right, so enough about that. So what is the Mishnah? The Mishnah was compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince, in around the year 200 of the Common Era. So you'll notice that that's about just under 40 years after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. The outcome of the Bar Kokhba rebellion was really bad for rabbis. And anyone who pays attention on Tisha B'Av or on Yom Kippur has read these long, difficult elegies about the rabbis who were killed by the Romans. And that's in kind of part of like the outcome of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, is that all of a sudden rabbis become targets, the Torah becomes a target, and Rabbi Judah the Prince said, let's make sure that the oral Torah, which was contained within these people, contained within these teachers, is not going to be forgotten. We have to compile it into the Mishnah. The Mishnah is almost entirely written in Mishnaic Hebrew, though they're in a Greek-speaking environment and it utilizes Greek terms. So sometimes you don't even realize it's words that have made it so deeply into our kind of like Jewish vocabulary. You don't realize that they're Greek, but the kind of greatest example of it is afikoman, not a Hebrew word. There's a bunch of other ones that appear kind of throughout the Mishnah. They're typically pretty obvious that they're not Hebrew words. One that appears often is apotropos or something like that. And you hear it and you're like, that's not a Hebrew word. So that's Greek. And Greek was the language, even though they're under Roman imperial power, they're still speaking Greek. The rabbis who teach the Mishnah, as we've mentioned a number of times, are called Tanaim. And the Mishnah is organized not like Midrash Halacha, which are organized according to the Torah's organization. It's organized in a new type of organization where there are 6 sedarim, 6 different seders, 6 orders. Each order contains masechtot, tractates. Those tractates are divided into chapters, and the chapters each contain mishnayot, a mishnah meaning a teaching. So sedarim, each seder contains tractates. The tractates which within each seder, you might think, wow, they're organized by such like an interesting organizational model. Really, they're organized by longest to shortest for the most part, with a few exceptions. So brachot is the beginning of the Mishnah. It's the beginning of the tractate called Zeraim, and it is shorter than Peah, which is the next tractate within Seder Zeraim. But the organizers of the Mishnah really wanted to begin with brachot, so brachot comes first. So there are a few exceptions here and there, but for the most part, it's just longest to shortest, which means that if you participate in Mishnah Yomi, for example, which just started its new cycle very recently, as you go through, you'll realize, oh, wow, these are going by much faster. And even within the Gemara, sometimes we're seeing that now in the Daf Yomi cycle, you get towards the end of a Seder and things often, but not always, start to kind of speed up, because that's how the Sidarim are actually organized. But they're also organized, primarily they're organized thematically. So, and we'll talk about that more a little bit next time. The Mishnah was the first compilation of the oral law, and so it really reads like a law code, except that it contains minority opinion. So before I mentioned that they're really trying to kind of organize the Tanaim, one of their big projects is to really try and like organize the Jewish people and unify the Jewish people around the oral law, around like the Pharisaic tradition. And at the same time, the Pharisaic tradition is a multivocal tradition, and the Mishnah itself contains minority opinions, and it also contains a couple, but always amazing and very special, short stories. And more than a couple, really, like they're not as uncommon as you think, the little Mishnaic stories, but it's like very interesting that they're even in there. And typically, there's no reasoning or proof text that is provided for the laws. So as opposed to in Midrash Halacha, where it's all about the proof text, it's like, here's what the verse says, and now here's the law. The Mishnah, for the most part, is not interested in what the verse says. It just tells you the law. And that's where the Talmud comes in. We'll get to that soon. The Mishnah does not begin with first principles and actually almost never explains its terms. So the Talmud spends a lot of time explaining the Mishnah's terms. And if you're just trying to learn the Mishnah straight, that's really one of the hardest things about it. And that's why you'll need a very robust commentary to kind of help you along that journey of learning the Mishnah. The Mishnah does utilize literary structures, parallelisms, keywords, and often that actually teaches deep meaning and shows themes in the law itself. There's been great, we live in a time where the study of Mishnah has been really revolutionized, and there's some really wonderful people like Rabbi Avi Wallfish who are really pushing people to study Mishnah for these like parallels in terms and to see the literary structures within the Mishnah. Okay. The last thing I want to say is that the Mishnah, we say that the Mishnah was compiled because although it is extremely carefully organized, it wasn't necessarily originally written down, and it clearly was meant to be memorized. You can find mnemonic devices, which are memory devices, throughout the Mishnah. We're in the Afumi cycle now, we're in the middle of Masachet, or towards the end of Masachet Megillah, and you might have noticed that in the Mishnayot of the first chapter of Masachet Megillah, many of them contain this phrase, in Bain, there's no difference between this and that. And they actually are really, they start out with examples that are relevant to Purim and Megillat Esther, and then they become these very wide-ranging examples. And the reason why they're all together is because that's a mnemonic device that would help someone who is memorizing the Mishnah would learn all of those Mishnayot kind of together as a package. And clearly that's one of many examples that really shows that the Mishnah was meant from the very beginning to be memorized. The other important thing to know about that is that every rabbi in the Talmud, and also for much of Jewish history, you can just assume that they had the entire Mishnah committed to memory. And that's just important in terms of when you're reading the Talmud and you hear about a certain rabbi and he says a certain thing, you have to always understand that like they're saying that with a certain library that's sitting in their back pocket, and the Mishnah, in addition to the Tanakh, are that library. And the Talmud itself really assumes that you know the entire Mishnah by heart and that you know all of Tanakh by heart. Don't fret when that's not the case for you. There's lots of tools, thank God, available to us now to overcome those knowledge gaps on our behalf as learners, but the Talmud definitely as a text assumes it. And we'll get there again. So here's an example of just the Mishnah and the genre that is the Mishnah, just to show how different it is from Midrash Halacha. So here's an example of the Mishnah. This is from the order, the Seder of Nizikin. It's from Masachet Bava Kamma, the 8th chapter, the first Mishnah. So we would refer to that as Bava Kamma, Mishnah Bava Kamma 8:1, okay? Because it's from the 8th chapter, the first Mishnah, and we wouldn't tell you what Seder it was in, usually when we were referring to it. So that's part of the challenge is when someone refers to a Mishnah, let's say something you've never heard of before, the Mishnah Uktzin or Zavim or something like that. There's all sorts of Mishnayot that are less studied than maybe something like Pirkei Avot or Brachot. And one of the challenges is when someone refers to it, it's very unlikely that they're going to tell you what Seder it's in, what order it's in. And that's one of the big challenges in studying Mishnah is kind of getting your hand around what are the different orders each about? And then when someone mentions a tractate, having a sense of, oh, I know which order that tractate would fit into. Now I know how to find it on my bookshelf, which is organized by order. Okay. So here's the Mishnah, Bava Kamma 8:1, Hachovel b'chaveros. So someone who injures another is liable to pay compensation for that injury. So chayav alav, and they're liable to pay compensation for that injury because under 5 types of indemnity. So they have to pay 5 different types of payments for a certain injury, mishum chamisha dvarim. So those 5 are nezek, tsar, ripui, shevet, and boshet. Damage, pain, medical costs, loss of livelihood, and humiliation. So we're going to note a few things about this Mishnah. The Mishnah assumes that multiple kinds of payments are normal, and that's the expectation. Whereas even within the psukim itself, that isn't so obvious. The Mishnah makes no reference at all to Torah verses. It's extremely practical. The Mishnah creates numbered categories, right? So the Mishnah could have said, one who injures another is liable to pay compensation for that injury. And here are the ways of that compensation. But the Mishnah goes out of its way to say mishum chamisha devarim, because of with 5 different types. And the Mishnah loves this kind of numbered categorization. And a part of that is that it helps you remember, right? If you were to say, if you were going shopping and you said, I need 5 things, and you didn't want to write down a list, you would just remember 5 things. That's going to help you remember what those 5 things are, because you know there's 5 of them. And so you'll know if you're missing something, and then it'll help you fill in what that gap is. So that's just another one of these memory devices that the Mishnah utilizes all the time throughout the Mishnah. And the other thing I want to point out is that medical costs, ripui, and therefore people who are charging that money, doctors, medical practice, are included, and they're just straightforwardly assumed. So something that the Midrash Halacha had to learn out from the verses, the Mishnah says, no, this is obvious. We're not going to learn it out because we don't make mention of verses. We have the oral law, and we know that doctors are allowed to practice medicine. 2 pieces of Mishnah vocabulary that I want to draw your attention to. So as we've discussed already, a Tana is just a name that refers to any rabbi whose view is recorded in the Mishnah, or who lived at the time of the Mishnah. These rabbis lived in Israel, and they lived around the years like 10 to 200 of the Common Era. And the Gemara sometimes will say, we'll just use the word Tana to refer even to a named teacher in the Mishnah. So that's just for your Gemara learning, it's a very important word to know. And then the other one is the Tana Kamma. So you might have noticed that in this Mishnah, for example, it's not taught under any name. It's not like Rabbi Akiva says that the one who injures another is liable to pay compensation for that injury due to 5 types of indemnity. No, it's unnamed. So we regularly refer to that like unnamed author voice of the Mishnah as the Tana Kamma, the unnamed first opinion. It just means the first Tana. That's what the word Tana Kamma means. It's often assumed to be the majority opinion, and also the opinion held by the Mishnah's compiler, who, once again, that's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So we give a lot of weight to the Tana Kamma unless it gets proven otherwise. But in general, we should assume the halacha is like the Tana Kamma. Okay, so there's stuff that didn't make it into the Mishnah. So I'm calling that the Mishnah's cutting room floor. So there's many teachings by Tanaim that did not make it into the Mishnah. What happened to those teachings by those Tanaim? So some, as we mentioned, were preserved in collections of Midrash Halacha. Some were preserved in the Tosefta. Tosefta literally means addition. And though scholars disagree about whether the Tosefta predates or postdates the Mishnah, that still everyone would agree it's Tanaitic opinions. Some of those opinions in the Tosefta are in the Mishnah, but there's also expansions on them, other opinions that didn't make it into the Mishnah, similar opinions that are phrased differently, all sorts of interesting things in the Tosefta. We have other teachings by Tanaim that were preserved orally and passed down, and then they make their way into the Talmud. And in the Talmud, they're referred to as BARAITA. We'll talk about that term in just a moment. And then, of course, there's lots of teachings that unfortunately, were not preserved. And that, of course, continues to this day. Lots of teachers teach lots of students, and those teachings are not preserved. And that's just the way of the world. I do want to draw attention to the picture. If you're saying to yourself, wow, the Tosefta sounds awesome and so interesting, I need to have one at home in my library. The kind of best edition of the Tosefta is the Lieberman edition called the Tosefta Kishtuta. There's both an edition of the Tosefta and a very careful commentary on it as part of this collection. So just if you're looking to get a Tosefta, there's definitely better and worse ones. And again, a lot of that is manuscript problems and manuscript variances. A lot of these texts that aren't like the Mishnah, they're like these almost like secondary texts, maybe we would say. They also then weren't preserved as carefully. And so one of the big challenges with those texts is, again, making sure that we have actually the best that we can say to what the text actually meant or what originally was. Okay, so a vocabulary note on this word BARAITA. So the word BARAITA in the Talmud refers to any Tanaitic teaching that was not included in the Mishnah. And the word literally means an outside teaching. That's what the word BARAITA means, but like outside of what? Doesn't mean that it was taught like in the great outdoors or on a mountaintop, but it just means outside of the Mishnah. A BARAITA, when you come across a BARAITA while you're learning the Gemara, It could be that that BARAITA is included in other collections of Tanaitic teachings like Midrash Halacha, like Tosefta, but not necessarily. The Talmud is extremely interested in preserving BARAITot. So the Talmud very often will bring in these BARAITot into conversation with the Mishnah, which we'll see happen when we get to the Talmud today. And usually a BARAITA does not carry the same weight as a Tanaitic statement, so a statement from the same time period that was preserved in the Mishnah, but sometimes it does. So in general, when you meet a BARAITA, you should assume the Mishnah is kind of primary to it, but you'll see what the Gemara does with it. Sometimes the Gemara will actually then go on to say, oh, this is a separate opinion, or let's actually amend the Mishnah in order to make it work with the BARAITA or make it say what the BARAITA says. Most often, the Talmud will go to great lengths to make sure that the Mishnah and BARAITA do not actually contradict each other. And we'll get back to that. We'll get back to that in a future session. Okay, so now we have to talk about what you all came here for, which are the Talmuds. Okay, you're saying, what are the Talmuds? Is there more than one? Yes, there is. So the Talmuds were written by Amoraim. So that's, we say, approximately from the year 200 until approximately the year 500. And now we are no longer just in Eretz Israel. So when we talk about Tanaim, we're only in the land of Israel. And now all of a sudden, the first Amoraim, that's where you see this split between Eretz Israel. So let's say Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, they stay in Eretz Israel, but Rav travels from Eretz Israel to Bavel. And now the community in Bavel is ancient. This is not the beginning of a Jewish community in Bavel. The first exile was sent to Bavel. And when Ezra brought people back to reestablish the Beit HaMikdash, not everyone came. So you have this very flourishing community in Bavel, though now we start to see this like split in rabbinic culture where some people are staying in the yeshivot of the land of Israel, and some of them are going to Bavel. So when we're talking about Amoraim, we're talking about some in the land of Israel, some in Bavel, and actually a few who go back and forth. So the first one I'm going to talk about, and we're just going to talk about it briefly, is the Talmud Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is written in Jewish Palestinian Aramaic, which is similar but different from Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, which is what the Bavli is in. You're used to reading the Bavli, and then you open up the Yerushalmi, you are in for a little bit of an adjustment, definitely. It's compiled about 100 years before the Bavli is compiled. And records, what it records is mostly Torah studied in the yeshivot of Tveria and Caesarea. The rabbis, as I mentioned before, the rabbis of the Talmud are called Amoraim, but Amoraim in Israel often still carry the title of rabbi. So sometimes people like to say, oh, how do you tell the difference between a Tana and an Amora? Well, Tanaim are called rabbi and Amoraim are called rav. This is not the case for Amoraim in Israel. So that trick does not always work. So the rabbis in the Yerushalmi are often called still rabbi or rebbe. The Yerushalmi covers different masachtot of the Mishnah than the Bavli does. Neither of them cover the entire Mishnah. So the Yerushalmi includes large amounts of Seder Zra'im, which are about laws that are specific to the land of Israel. So let's say right now we're in a Shemitah year. The Yerushalmi has has Talmud on Shavuot, which are the Mishnayot about the Shemitah year, but the Bavli does not. The Yerushalmi also has Gemara on Masachet Shkalim, which is in Moed, and that's actually the only piece of the Yerushalmi that's included in the Daf Yomi cycle. So you might be familiar with the Yerushalmi a little bit from Masachet Shkalim. The Yerushalmi has a lot less stam than the Bavli, and if that word feels confusing to you right now, we're going to spend a lot of time on that word, even going forward in this class, and then definitely a lot in the next class, so don't worry if that word feels confusing. But what that means is that the Yerushalmi reads a lot more like a list of statements and a lot less like clear question, answer number one, answer number two, answer number three, much more just like a list of statements that don't necessarily, it doesn't like thread them together as nicely as the Bavli typically does. Another really important thing to know if you ever want to open a Yerushalmi is that the page numbers in the Yerushalmi are not standardized. So when you are making a reference to somewhere in the Yerushalmi, you're going to reference it chapter and halacha. So under each chapter, you're going to have halachot. Typically, that numbering system of halachot is Mishnah by Mishnah. It's slightly more complicated than that, but that's the general gist of it. And that just makes things a little bit harder to find in the Yerushalmi than they are in the Bavli. And it's not to say that when you open up an edition of the Yerushalmi, there are no page numbers. There are. It's just that the page numbers aren't standardized between different editions in the way that they are in the Bavli. So don't get thrown off by the page numbers in the Yerushalmi. Because when you'll say, open up to page 14b, and someone else is going to have different words on their page 14b in their version of the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi was, and it continues today, to not be as robustly studied as the Bavli. And so its role in kind of the history of halacha is a lot less direct than the Bavli. Rashi, for example, seems to mostly have not had the Yerushalmi at all. But Tosfot, so a generation or 2 generations past Rashi, definitely did have a lot of it. They make frequent reference to it. And when we're talking about halacha, the Yerushalmi mostly becomes important when it's brought into the conversation by medieval commentators and halachists. So the Yerushalmi is not kind of like inherently halachically important. It's important once it's like brought into the conversation by others, which is not to say that the Yerushalmi isn't important or shouldn't be studied. It's a tremendous part of our heritage, of course. But just to say that when we're talking about like, oh, the Yerushalmi says this, how come that's like not what we do? That might be part of the reason. Okay, so now to our hero, the Talmud Bali. So the Talmud Bali is written in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. It was compiled around the year 500 of the Common Era, and it records the Torah studied in the yeshivot of Bavel. So those include yeshivot in places like Sura, Pumbedita, Naharda, which was mentioned on yesterday's daf as a place where lots of Jews are, and there may be davening all over the place. That was in yesterday's daf. Mechoza is another big yeshiva and big community in Bavel. The rabbis, as I mentioned previously, the rabbis of the Talmud are called Amoraim, but the Amoraim in Bavel are often referred to by the title of Rav, or sometimes just like a first name or even a nickname. It's not uncommon and it's not disrespectful when the Talmud refers to a rabbi by just their first name. So for example, I mentioned before a rabbi who is known only as Rav, and his kind of frequent argument buddy, we call that a bar plugta, is named Shmuel, and it's not disrespectful to refer to him as Shmuel because that's how the Talmud does, and the Talmud means no disrespect by it. Shmuel is a very important Amora. So the Talmud covers masachtot that are relevant to Jewish life in exile, including excluding Israel-bound commandments, but it does include, unlike the Yerushalmi, it does include tractates on temple ritual. If you're interested in a very fun little like blip in Jewish history, there was a big counterfeit scandal of someone who said, oh, I found the Yerushalmi on all these temple ritual stuff. And then like some people believed him and some people didn't believe him, and it was a whole big thing. Anyways, for your own research on the side, but now we're fairly certain that his manuscripts were counterfeit and that these never existed or no longer exist. The Bali is much more highly polished than the Yerushalmi. It includes many layers. We're going to go into depth on this in the next session. The page numbers of the Bali have been standardized since the 1523 publishing of the Bali by the Bamberg Press. When we talk about pages, we actually mean folios. So they have an A side and a B side, or an Amud Aleph and an Amud Bet. Daf Yomi, which studies a folio, so would study both an A side and a B side every day, would not be possible, obviously, if not for this standardized pagination. So Daf Yomi was started approximately 300 years after the standardized pagination, and that is what enabled anyone who wants to participate in the daf to be on the same page every day of the year for 7.5 years in a cycle. Wouldn't be possible without the standardization of that 1523 Bamberg Press edition. The Bali is the cornerstone of Jewish law as we know it. It's the primary text studied in yeshivot. There are commentaries on commentaries on commentaries continuing up until today. I would argue that the Hadran podcast is the the only complete commentary by a woman on the Bavli, but it's a commentary written or spoken onto the Bavli up till today, and many of those commentaries are foundational to future codes of Jewish law. So, of course, the ones we're in the earliest ones, which we'll talk about next week. But even up to today, you never know in 100 years who's gonna listen to or read whose commentary on it and bring that commentary into the halachic and legal conversation as well. Okay, so here's an example, just to give you a sense of how the Talmud is different from, let's say, the Mishnah. So here we start out, we have a named statement by Rav Papa in the name of Rava. Both of these are Amoraim in Bavel. And they say, Amar Kra, the verse says, right? So already they're quoting a verse. This is great. They're quoting a verse, Veravo Yerafei, he will cause him to be thoroughly healed. And Rav Papa and Rava learn out a halacha from this. Litain refuah bimkom nazek. The doubled term of Rapo Yerapei comes to teach us that the person who caused the injury is liable to give monetary compensation for medical costs once he's already paid compensation for damage. So what you might have thought, oh, I'll only pay one of these 5 types of damages. No, says Rav Papa in the name of Rava, Rapo Yerapei comes to teach that you actually you pay both the medical costs and the damages costs. You pay multiple types of damages for every act of damage that you did. The Gemara goes on to say, hold on, this verse that Rav Papa in the name of Rava is teaching from, that verse is already taken. So Gemara has this rule that every piece of a verse can only teach one halacha, and it says, hold on, that piece of the verse is already taken for this teaching that we know is from the Mechilta, but that we're going to see here, the Gemara doesn't say it's from the Mechilta, it's the teaching of the school of Rabbi Yishmael. So you'll notice here, Rabbi Yishmael, right? So that's like a hint that at least Rabbi Yishmael is in Eretz Yisrael, and we know that Rabbi Yishmael is a Tana. So as it's taught in the house of Rabbi Yishmael, Vera po Yerapei, the verse says, Vera po Yerapei, Mikan shenitna reshut lerofei lerapot. From here we learn that permission is granted to a doctor to heal. And you can't learn 2 different rules, says the Gemara, from the same verse. So what are we going to do about it? So the Gemara is going to say, we're actually going to reject the teaching from the house of Rabbi Yishmael. The Gemara, so here's the Stam piping in, Imkin nichtov kra verofei yerapei. If that's what the Torah meant, then the Torah would have said verofei, and a doctor shall heal. Shema mina, we can learn out from here. Litain refuah bimkom nazek. So we learn out from verofei yerapei that really it's what Rav Papa in the name of Rava taught, and that the verse teaches that you're liable to give both monetary compensation for medical costs and you're supposed to pay for damages. Okay, if you didn't follow all of that, I'm here to much less about the content and much more about the genre. And I hope you saw how different that genre was from what we saw in the Mishnah. So here's a few things to note. We have a combination of Aramaic and Hebrew. So Haimi Baile, that's an Aramaic phrase. And yet, when we're quoting the Midrash Halacha from Rabbi Yishmael, Mikan Shenitna Reshut, that's Hebrew, right? So the Gemara kind of seamlessly goes between one and the next, and we'll talk about how to mark those transitions and what those transitions can help us identify. We'll talk about that in the next class. The Gemara is not a code, and it's much more of a discussion than it is a code. The discussion includes citations of Torah texts as well as teachings by both Tanaim, so that would be Rabbi Yishmael, and Amoraim, so that would be Rav Papa and Rava. And then there's this narrating stam. So the stam raised the problem, right? So in the English translation I brought you here, which is from Sefaria, it's the Koran translation, it says the Gemara challenges, but you could also say the stam of the Gemara challenges. It's that narrating voice that pushes the Gemara forward. the Torah verses, I want you to notice, are often quoted by only a few words. There's no point in this conversation where the whole of the Torah verse under discussion is quoted. The reader is expected to know the whole of Tanakh by heart. And as I mentioned, don't let this scare you off or say, oh, I can't learn Gemara until I know all of Tanakh by heart. No, there are tools available to help with that. Again, we'll talk about that next time. But just notice that that's an assumption that the Gemara has about its readers that we have to compensate for when we don't know all of Tanakh by heart. The other thing I want you to notice is that the Gemara doesn't make explicit that Rav Papa and Rabbi Ishmael lived centuries apart. The Gemara puts them into argument with each other, but you are expected to know it. You as a reader are definitely expected to know it. Okay, a few other things. So the Gemara brings the Mishnah back into conversation with Midrash Halacha, and that then closes the loop between the written Torah and the oral Torah. So if all you had in your library was Tanakh and the Mishnah, you'd be like, I don't understand how these things are connected. And one of the big projects of the Gemara is to say, oh, with those two things in your library, let me show you how to connect the dots between them. So the Stam, so here again, the Gemara, what it does here is it contrasts to Midrash Halacha. It brings out a problem and it makes very clear what its problem is. So in this case, its problem is each part of a verse can only teach one halacha. And here we have two Midrash Halacha that are rooted in the same piece of the verse. And then the Stam resolves the problem by rejecting one of the Midrash Halacha. Oh, if that Midrash Halacha were right, the verse would say something different. The verse doesn't say that. So we're going to reject that Midrash Halacha in this instance. Okay. We have come a long way in the last hour. So we started in around the year 200 before the Common Era. We started with the Zugot at the times of the Maccabean revolt. And now we have made it all the way to the Bavli and to the Bavli in its final form. So again, next week, we're going to talk about what does it mean, the Bavli in its final form? And that's around the year 500. There were probably additions to the Bavli a little bit after that. But when we talk about the Bavli being compiled, that's the year 500. We met the Tanaim and their two major genres of literature. By that, I mean Midrash Halacha and legal texts, with like a subcategory of legal texts being like a few stories here and there. And the Moraim, we'll talk more about the different genres within the Bavli next time. I know I keep saying next time, but it's a 3-part series, so I'm allowed. And we'll meet some of these characters that I just threw onto here. We'll meet some of those characters in greater depth in future sessions as well. But I just wanted to give you a sense, here's your Talmudic timeline. Now you're masters of it a little bit. And on every page of the Talmud, pieces of this Talmudic timeline will be relevant to your reading. And it'll help you, just having this in your head a little bit, will help you understand what you're reading just one little bit better. So join us in a week from now at exactly this time for session 2. And what we're gonna do now is I think I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. They're gonna stop the recording and then restart the recording. And then we'll be able to take questions. And the way I'm gonna take questions is by reading them from the chat. So I can see that there's been a lot happening in the chat until now. I'm not gonna have read anything up from what people are putting in now, just so we're clear on what's about to happen.